There are moments in life when you feel like you've prayed every prayer you could, done everything logic told you to do, yet your heart is still heavy, and life feels motionless. No moving forward, no breakthrough, no escape from something clinging to you like an old shadow. I remember sitting by the window one gray afternoon, watching thin drops of rain slide down the glass. There was no sound, only my own breathing, and a feeling I couldn't name, tired but not ready to give up. Maybe you've been there too, a moment no one sees, but enough to make you whisper inside, God, I need you to show me something, a direction, a sign, even just one small step. And then, unexpectedly, the answer didn't come the way I imagined. Not a bolt of lightning from the sky, not a loud, thunderous voice, just a very soft, very strange thought. So much so that I wondered if I made it up myself. Take a piece of paper, write your name, then place it in salt water. I laughed, truly, because it didn't sound like anything I had ever been taught in church, nor anything that belonged to my adult spiritual life. But oddly, even though my mind reacted, my heart stayed quiet. No resistance, no discomfort, just attention. It felt like standing at a crossroads and a very gentle breeze tugged at your sleeve, not strong enough to force you, but enough to make you pause and wonder, are you inviting me to take one small step into something new? I didn't understand it. I only sensed one thing. Sometimes God doesn't wait for us to be ready with understanding. He waits for us to open our hearts with simplicity. That was the first moment that made me begin to reflect more deeply about salt, about water, about the name of a human being, and why sometimes God leads us through actions that feel unusual, yet touch the deepest places of the soul. Today, I want to share that story with you. Not to convince you to try anything, but to invite you to walk with me into a journey where seemingly small things carry a quietly profound spiritual meaning. This journey is not about ritual, not about superstition, not about instant miracles. It is about a personal conversation with God, opened through an action that appears very simple. And maybe, somewhere along this path, you too will hear him whisper something to your heart, gentle, unexpected, yet full of power. Why would anyone put their name in salt water? Isn't that weird? That is the natural reaction anyone would have when hearing about a symbolic spiritual act, because throughout our lives, we're used to understanding first before we act. If we can't explain it, we tend to consider it unreasonable or not worth trying. Humans often look for certainty in what is familiar. Anything we can't explain, we doubt. Anything that goes beyond the patterns of logic, we call strange. But Scripture operates on a very different rhythm. In it, faith doesn't always begin with understanding. Sometimes it begins with a small step, a gentle but sincere response. In the spiritual journey, there are two kinds of belief. Rational faith, believing when we understand, when I can explain it, I will believe. Experiential faith, believing through experience. I follow God's prompting first, and he will help me understand along the way. Once, Dr. Yonggi Cho shared that God often uses simple acts of obedience, small, sincere actions, to open the door to greater things in the spiritual realm. No complexity needed, no grand ritual required, just a simple gesture, but one filled with obedience. And this is exactly what confuses many people. Many things God leads us to do don't make logical sense at first, but they are completely consistent with the way he works in Scripture. Because sometimes simplicity is the doorway to deeper healing and transformation. So stay with me. This isn't superstition, it's Scripture. And sometimes the very things that seem strange are the ways God gently touches places that logic could never reach. When we read Scripture, we often use the mindset of our own era to judge everything. But the Bible was born in a completely different culture, A world where people didn't just hear truth, they saw truth, touched truth, and practiced truth through tangible actions. In the context of the ancient Near East, the Jewish people did not separate the spiritual from the physical. To them, spirit and body were not two opposing worlds. They didn't speak of truth in abstract concepts. They used symbols, materials, and actions to illustrate what was happening in the unseen realm. The Jewish people had an approach known as concrete spirituality, a very embodied form of faith. If God taught about cleansing, they used water. If God taught about covenant, they used salt. If God wanted them to remember a promise, they raised a stone. If God wanted them to enter something new, they literally walked through the Jordan or through the sea. That was how they understood truth, not merely by thinking, but by experiencing. And so the symbols in Scripture are not artistic elements, nor literary metaphors. They hold three very clear layers of meaning. 1. Literal. The physical meaning. Salt is salt. Water is water. They exist tangibly, are used tangibly, can be touched tangibly. 2. Symbolic. The representational meaning. Salt becomes an image of preservation and purity. Water becomes an image of cleansing and new beginnings. 3. Prophetic. The spiritual, transcendent meaning. When God instructs the use of a specific symbol, that action becomes a bridge between the invisible and the human reality. This aligns with the teaching of Dr. David Yonggi Cho, who said that spiritual symbols have the ability to pull the invisible into the visible realm, not through the power of the material itself, but by opening the heart for God to move. So if we want to understand why salt and water appear so frequently in Scripture, we must step into the worldview of the people who lived in that world. A world where every object had a voice, every action carried meaning, and every symbol was a doorway into something deeper. From that perspective, salt and water begin to reveal layers of significance that we would never fully grasp just by reading the text on the surface. When Scripture mentions salt, it is not merely referring to a small white mineral we sprinkle on food. In the ancient world, salt was a vivid symbol filled with multiple layers of meaning, each layer opening a new perspective on how God forms, protects, and purifies the spiritual life of His people. 1. Salt as covenant. In ancient times, when two people wanted to establish an unbreakable covenant, they used salt. Not because salt was precious, but because salt does not decay, does not rot, and does not change its nature over time. When the Bible calls it a covenant of salt, the emphasis is on durability, a commitment that no natural force can destroy. Here, salt becomes a reminder that what belongs to God once He has spoken it endures forever. 2. Salt as purity. If you've ever cleaned a wound with salt water, you know the feeling of it stings, but it cleans. Salt does not compromise with infection. It resists everything that tries to destroy life. That picture reflects holiness in the spiritual life. Holiness is not cold perfection. It is God gently removing the things that weaken our souls, even when He must touch the most painful places inside us. 3. Salt as preservation. Before refrigerators existed, salt was the only way to keep meat from rotting. It resisted decay and protected something from being corrupted over time. When believers are called to be the salt, they carry a very practical role to keep what is valuable around them. Family, marriage, community, from being spoiled by bitterness, deceit, or despair. Salt makes what is good last longer and slows the spread of what is harmful. 4. Salt as identity. Salt of the earth is not a casual compliment. It is a calling. It means that believers do not merely exist in this world. They carry a quiet but powerful influence, just as salt doesn't make noise yet changes the entire flavor of a dish. Salt in modern culture. Today, most of us treat salt as just a seasoning, something cheap, common, used to flavor food and forgotten immediately afterward. Some people see it as a charm of good luck, sprinkling salt at the door, throwing it over the shoulder, superstitious practices. Others see salt as nothing spiritual at all, just a physical substance. But in the world of Scripture, salt was never viewed this way. Salt always carried responsibility. The responsibility to keep the heart pure, to keep relationships strong, to keep covenant with God, and to keep the world around us from being corrupted by destructive forces. Once we understand this, salt is no longer an ordinary household item. It becomes an invitation to live a life of weight, depth, and meaning. A life where every gesture and attitude carries the preserving touch of God. And from that perspective, we begin to see that salt was never just salt. It is an essential part of how God teaches His people to live a life of true influence. Water appears throughout Scripture, but it never appears randomly. Every time water is mentioned, it carries a quiet depth, subtle, gentle, yet powerfully touching the human spirit. And when we look at the layers of meaning behind water, we begin to see a complete picture of how God renews a life from the inside out. Layer 1. Cleansing. In the Old Testament, the priests could not enter the holy place without washing their hands and feet. It wasn't about hygiene. It was a reminder that no one can draw near to the presence of God with hands still carrying the dust of the world. Then in the New Testament, this image goes even deeper through the baptism of Jesus. He did not need cleansing. He was opening a pathway, showing that water could become the stage for a life stepping into a new chapter, leaving the old behind. Water washes what the eyes can see, but in Scripture, it also washes what only the heart knows. Layer 2. Separation. Water not only cleanses, it divides. When the Red Sea opened, Israel crossed an invisible boundary. On one side was slavery, on the other was freedom. They weren't just moving from point A to point B. They were crossing a season of life to become a new people. The Jordan River carries the same meaning. One side was waiting, delay, and years of weary repetition in the wilderness. The other side was the promise God had already prepared for them. Water marks the place where a person leaves the old and steps into what God has set before them. Layer 3. New creation. In the opening lines of Scripture, the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. No form, no structure, just a world still in chaos. And God began to touch it to bring forth life. When the Spirit moves over water, it is the sign of a new beginning. Something is being prepared. A life is being rearranged from within. Through this, we see that water in Scripture is not only something that cleans, but the foundation of new creation. Layer 4. Healing waters. The Pool of Bethesda is a unique story. No one controlled when the water moved. No one chose the timing. No one could force the angel to stir the surface. The stirring of the water was a moment of opportunity. Unexpected, brief, yet enough for anyone who stepped in to receive healing. A body of water that looked still could suddenly become the place where God revealed His power. In psychology, water-related rituals often bring release, washing hands to let go, soaking in water to relax, standing under a shower to feel lighter after a heavy day. The effect lies in the sensation, in the clarity of the mind. But in Scripture, water goes far beyond release. It doesn't merely help a person feel better, it leads them into true renewal from the inside, from meaning, from the direction of their life. Water itself has no power to change anyone's destiny. But God uses water as a powerful symbol to bring a person to the place where they are ready to step into what He wants to do. When we understand this, we begin to see water with different eyes. not as an ordinary liquid, but as a reminder that there are seasons, moments, and steps God prepares for each person, gentle yet deep, like the flowing of water itself. When it comes to spiritual actions, what confuses people most is the line between something God is truly leading and something that carries the tone of superstition. At first glance, the two may look alike. Both involve simple gestures, both use ordinary materials, both are often done quietly between a person and God alone. But beneath the surface, they are completely different. Superstition always carries the spirit of control. It whispers a sweet idea into the human mind. If I do this correctly, the outcome I want must happen. The object in hand becomes a source of power, and the action becomes a switch, as if flipping it will force the invisible to obey. It places the human being at the center, giving them the illusion that they can manipulate the spiritual realm. A prophetic act, however, does not begin with the person at all. It begins with the gentle prompting of God. It is the heart responding, "Because you are leading, I obey." The power is not in the material used, not in the motion, not in the ritual. Everything is simply a vessel through which the heart opens to God. Surrender is the place where His power is revealed. Scripture makes this unmistakably clear. Naaman was told to dip himself 7 times in the Jordan River. There was nothing special in that water. What mattered was that he humbled himself and stepped into it because God had spoken through the prophet. Israel marched around Jericho, not because footsteps can crack stone, but because they followed God's instruction, even when it looked nothing like a military strategy. Elisha threw salt into the spring of Jericho, and the water was healed. Not because salt can cure poisoned water, but because God acted through obedience. Yet these truths are easy to blur. Some people treat a prophetic act like a technique to create their own miracle, doing something to attract a desired outcome. Some see it as a formula. Follow the steps, and the result must appear. Some believe the materials, salt, water, paper, carry spiritual power on their own. These misunderstandings pull the heart away from the posture Scripture teaches. For all of these things, salt, water, a sheet of paper, are only symbols. They do not produce power. They hold meaning only when a person's heart is turned toward God. Not the salt, not the water, not the paper. It is God who acts. And once this becomes clear, the heart grows lighter. There is no pressure to get it perfect, no fear of missing a step, no anxiety about ruining a miracle by doing something wrong. What God looks for is a listening heart, a heart willing to follow His leading in quiet simplicity. Obedience is the flow. God is the source. When that truth settles into place, every prophetic act takes on its true meaning, and a person can step into it with peace, not hurried, not fearful, but simply responding to the one who is whispering within. A person's name has never been just a string of letters. In Scripture, a name carries depth. It speaks of destiny, calling, and the path God already sees long before the one who bears that name understands what is unfolding in their life. When God changes someone's name, He isn't simply changing what others call them. He is touching their story, rewriting the part that was lost or the part they never believed they deserved. Abraham was once Abram, exalted father. But God saw beyond his limitations and named him Abraham, father of many nations, at a time when he didn't have a single child. Jacob carried a name that meant heel grabber, deceiver, a label tied to failures and the wounds of youth. But in one night of wrestling with God, the Lord called him something new, Israel, one who wrestles with God. Simon was impulsive, unpredictable, easily swayed like grass in the wind, yet Jesus called him Peter, rock, long before he ever grew into that identity. These stories mirror something deeply human. Every person carries layers within the name they bear. There is the part that comes from generations before, The patterns passed down through family, the struggles we inherit without choosing, the cycles we are born into and must confront. There is the part shaped by personal experience. The labels life stuck onto us. The wounds that make us look at ourselves with doubt in our own worth. The mistakes that convince us we may never stand strong again. And there is the part that comes from God, the name He calls us by, rooted in what He sees deep in the soul. When someone writes their name on paper, something quiet yet powerful happens. A name that once lived in memory, in story, in emotion, hidden in places no one sees, is lifted into the open before God. Writing it out is like placing identity in the light where He can look into it and touch what needs renewal. It is a way of bringing the self out of hiding, removing the layers that once stood between a person and the one who knows them more deeply than they know themselves. In that moment, it is not the hand that is acting. It is the heart that is opening. A person is not merely putting ink onto paper, they are inviting God into the deepest chambers of their story. They are not just writing a name, they are placing into His hands everything that name carries. The pain, the expectations, the failures, the dreams, the unspoken parts of their soul. That handwriting holds both past and future. And when it is placed into salt water, the moment becomes more than a physical gesture. It is the surrendering of identity, allowing God to redefine what life once distorted. It is not the ink that dissolves, but the weight within. It is not the water touching the paper, but God touching the true self. A name can hold an entire life, and when placed in God's hands, that life can be written anew in a way no human effort could ever accomplish. When someone steps into the act of writing their name and placing it into salt water, the most important thing is not the ritual itself, but the posture of the heart. Everything begins with stillness. Before doing anything, find a quiet space where noise fades and the mind can settle, where the heart becomes more sensitive to God's presence. You may open scripture, read a short passage, or simply whisper, "Lord, be here with me." That preparation is like opening a window to let fresh air flow into a room that has felt heavy for far too long. When you pick up the paper and pen, don't write in a hurry. Let each stroke of the pen be an expression of honesty. Write your name slowly, as if you were calling your true self out from beneath the worries, the wounds, and the layers life has piled over you. When you look at your name, ask gently, what in my life needs God's cleansing? What needs His keeping? Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's a strained relationship. Sometimes it's exhaustion. Sometimes it's something you've never said out loud. Before placing the paper into the bowl of salt water, pause. Take a deep breath and pray. It doesn't need to be long. Just speak honestly about what you are carrying. This is the moment you tell God, I place this into your hands. In that prayer, you lay the spiritual foundation before stepping into a symbolic gesture. Dr. David Yonggi Cho often reminded people that simple actions carry meaning only when joined with prayer, faith, and obedience. The three ingredients that turn a gesture into a pathway God can walk through. Then place the paper into the water. Not with force, not with the expectation of seeing something dramatic, but with release. This is not a moment to grasp for control. It is a moment to let it go. Salt water has no power on its own and no hidden spiritual energy. It is your surrender that opens space for God to do what He desires. Once the paper is in the water, your part is finished. Don't keep the water as if it were sacred. Pour it out just as you would wash your hands after a long day. This is a symbol, not an object of power. And whatever is happening in your heart is where God is truly at work. Afterward, take a few minutes to write in your journal. Perhaps a feeling, a thought, a whisper of something you sense God stirring within you. Sometimes the smallest shifts are the first signs of healing. Writing them down helps you notice what might be overlooked if kept only in your mind. This act may resemble certain symbolic exercises in psychology: writing, tearing, burning, or releasing something as a way to let go. But in your walk with God, it becomes something more than release. It opens a doorway for Him to touch the deepest layers of the soul. And it is also important to remember that this does not replace medical care, therapy, or professional support. God often uses doctors, counselors, and trained individuals to heal the parts we cannot face alone. In this gentle process, a hidden truth unfolds. It is not the act that transforms you, but the way you allow God to enter into it with you. And sometimes that simple openness is where something new quietly begins. When a person carries out a spiritual act, what they most often hope for is a clear sign, a strong shift that reassures them that God has heard, has seen, and has done something. But the reality of the spiritual life does not always match the way we hope it will unfold. We are used to things happening quickly, so quickly that we develop the assumption that if something doesn't change immediately, it must not be happening at all. Yet Scripture describes a very different rhythm, a process in which God works patiently, little by little, sometimes so quietly that the mind does not notice it right away. There are three ways God often moves. Sometimes it is an instant shift, a moment like a door swinging open, and deep inside you simply know that something has changed. But there are times when He chooses to transform gradually, as gently as water sinking into soil. So subtle that only when you look back do you realize how far you've traveled from where you began. And sometimes the change starts on the inside before it ever becomes visible on the outside. The inner world is freed first, and then behaviors, circumstances, and relationships begin to move in response. A common mistake many people make is believing that if they don't feel anything extraordinary, then nothing is happening. Some even assume that God is only at work when they experience intense spiritual sensations, trembling, emotion, or a rush of energy they can't explain. But feelings are only a very small part of the life of faith, and they are not the measure of what God is doing. Some changes are so gentle that they almost slip by unnoticed. Anxiety softens, and you realize only later that your breathing has grown easier. The tangled thoughts quiet down, making room for a clarity as soft as early morning light. Or a small courage rises, just enough to face something you once always avoided. These three might seem ordinary, but they are unmistakable marks of a hand quietly working in the deepest parts of the soul. These changes are not loud, not dramatic. They do not need noise to prove themselves. They are like small seeds planted in the earth, hidden, unseen, yet silently breaking open beneath the surface. And one day, you suddenly realize you have become someone different without knowing exactly when it happened. It is in this quietness that new life begins to form. And sometimes the most profound thing God does is not the immediate change of body or circumstance, but the simple shift of the heart into a new posture, lighter, clearer, and more at peace. When someone has written their name, placed it into salt water, and stepped out of that moment, the next step is not to wait for something dramatic or chase after an intense spiritual feeling. What truly matters is how they live afterward. A simple act can leave a gentle mark on the soul, like a new thread woven in, quietly guiding a person into a different way of being. Because when someone places their identity into God's hands, they no longer look at themselves the way they once did. Change often begins with speech. A person who once responded sharply, quickly, sometimes defensively, begins to speak more softly. Not because they are forcing themselves to be kind, but because deep within they know they belong to God. They sense that their identity has been touched, and their words naturally become a means of preserving and healing rather than harming. Just as salt keeps food from spoiling, words seasoned with grace keep relationships from decaying. Then the shift spreads into relationships. When someone senses God touching their identity, forgiveness becomes easier. Not because they forget the pain, but because they no longer carry the weight of defending their old self. When the old is released, there is enough peace to reach out, to speak honestly, to mend what was breaking, or simply to stop letting the past dictate the present. Reconciliation no longer feels like a difficult assignment. It becomes the natural movement of a heart made tender again. Habits begin to change as well. Not dramatic changes all at once, but small, steady shifts. A person who realizes they are called to live as someone renewed, washed, preserved, reshaped, naturally begins to adjust how they eat, sleep, work, and think. Old habits that once dragged them down slowly give way to new choices that reflect the name God calls them by. It is not forced discipline. It is a natural flow when someone senses they are stepping into a new chapter. And from there, their calling becomes clearer. There is no need for a loud voice from the sky. Only a renewed confidence. Enough to step into things they once believed they were unworthy of, or too weak to carry. When you know your name is held by God, you step into His path for your life with a quiet but steady confidence. You know you are not walking alone, and you know you no longer carry the old labels that once limited you. If you feel God stirring something in you, you may share your initials, just a few letters, as a way for me to pray for you. And if God has touched you in any way, big or small, you may share that too. Honest stories have a way of strengthening the faith of others. Before closing, I want to offer a prayer for you. You who are listening with an open heart. Lord, cleanse their soul with your gentleness. Preserve what is good within them and guard them from anything that would pull them away from you. Restore the places that have been wounded and bring new life into the parts they thought were gone. Let them walk in simple faith and quiet obedience, just as Dr. David Yonggi Cho taught, that you still do great things through small acts. May your hand be upon them, today and in the days ahead.